We're going to start out with a prayer by Elder Ed Warren, and then after he prays, Margaret Friesenhauer Hagen, we know her better as Margaret Hagen up here, she'll come and she's the moderator for the rest of the program.
Lord, we come into your presence with thanksgiving in our hearts that you are a merciful God. As we come together to learn something that has a definite bearing in our lives, such as new technique in mining, be with us as we begin to understand the finances of our nation, and that we come together because it is written, even when Jesus was walking on earth, there was a tax collector. Mining is for money. Help us to manage our time, manage our resources, and as we discuss the resources of gold, help us to be optimistic and yet be intelligent. We ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ, and we thank you, Lord, for what you are going to do. Amen.
Thank you, guys.
I'm going to come up here so we're close to the mic. Hi, I'm Margaret Hagen, and I'm just here to moderate today. I'm from KHNS, but this event is being organized by Takshnak Watershed Council, and there's lots of other organizations that are sponsoring it, and those organizations are Chilkat Indian Village, of course, Chilkoot Indian Association, Lincoln Gill Netters, Lincoln Conservation, Constantine Metal Resources, and the Haines Chamber of Commerce. So those are the sponsors for today's event. We had an event last night in Haines that had a great turnout, and we're kind of keeping the same format today, which is each of these gentlemen have a 20-minute presentation. There's 4 20-minute presentations. 3 of them are sharing their time. And so I'll introduce each one before their presentation, and they'll go through it. And then we'll have a short break. And then afterwards is time for questions and panel discussion. And last night, the way we did it is, I see a lot of you have pen and paper, which is great. There's some paper and pens back there too with Pat, to take notes during the presentation and write down any questions you may want to ask after the presentations. And then we'll take those written questions and we found that last night a lot of people had similar questions or topics, so we kind of group them together. And Meredith helps me go through those, and we'll ask as many as we can in the time we have, basically as long as we want to be here until 2 o'clock, or if we want to end early or whatever people are comfortable with. On a couple of the questions, the gentlemen kind of discuss among themselves their different viewpoints. Usually it's 1 or 2 of them answering the question, because 1 or 2 of them have the specific knowledge of what is asked. So we just kind of keep it loose and easy and whatever people are comfortable with. So I'm just here to help facilitate all that. If you had any questions, the presenters were chosen and organized by Takshnak, and all the other sponsors were just in support of that. So we will get started with the presentations, and we are starting with Mr. Bob Loeffler. He's a visiting professor of public policy from the UAA Institute of Social and Economic Research, former director of Division of Mining, Land, and Water with Department of Natural Resources. And he's going to be presenting on the different types of large mines operating in Alaska, different tailing storage techniques, and methods of water quality protection. So, Bob.
Thank you.
And we'll just, they have to share the mic, but let us know if you can't hear them, and they will gladly speak up.
Does this work? Can you hear me in the back? Nodding, yes? Okay. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to just take you through visually what a mine is, so that when you're talking about it and asking questions, you'll be able to visualize it. So that's what I'd like to do, and I'm to pay special attention to the kinds of processing people do to the ore, and then what they do with tailings afterwards, and I'll explain that. The other thing which So for those of you who were here last night, my apologies were roughly similar. I changed it a little bit, but my jokes are in the same place. So if you're, humor me by at least grinning the second time, I'd appreciate it. So as part of this, first some truth in advertising. I'm a visiting professor at UAA. The Council of Large Mines, or Council of Alaska Producers, gave a grant to UAA to hire a half-time professor, and UAA was confused enough to hire me. So for transparency, I don't work for them, I work for UAA, but you just need to know where the money comes from. And the other part is when I put a picture up there, I want to tell you what it is. So this is the mill at Kensington near Juneau. This is the ship loader at Greens Creek in Hawk Inlet, which is actually within the borough of Juneau. This is just a buoy. There's no barge there. And this is the water discharge at the Red Dog mine north of Kotzebue. This is that's actually the dorms and the water treatment plant up on the hill, and actually the state's mining lawyer. So, but just as a part of the introduction, I come from a regulatory background, and from my perspective, mining is really a water project. Gold or zinc or silver or copper, they're just byproducts. From my perspective, it's about keeping the water clean and the fish moving. So this is the same picture before. This is the Goodpaster River near the Pogo Gold Mine that we will be discussing, and some biomonitoring Fish and Game does south of, or just downstream of Fort Knox. So here's what we're not discussing. I know this area, because I've been told, has had a lot of placer mining, people washing gravels that were old stream gravels. That's really not what that's this. This is also a picture of what my mother thinks I would look like if it wasn't for her. But all he's doing is shoveling this stuff into the sluice box and washing gravels over it. And now they do that with a loader, but that's not what we're discussing. The history of sort of the movie version of old mining is this. We're discussing large mines. Now, nothing like this is likely to happen in this area of the country. That's what's billed as the largest hole on Earth. It's Bigham Canyon, just within the boundaries of Salt Lake City. It's hidden from the highway by waste rock piles, but it's within Salt Lake City. At least I think it is, because I'm sure they want to tax it. So we're not discussing that either. We're mostly going to be focusing on underground mines. This is a picture of Greens Creek, but really the larger mines. So what I'm going to do is walk you visually through an underground gold mine at Pogo. And I'm using Pogo because I just happen to have better pictures of it. So Pogo is 48 miles northeast of Delta. It looks like this. They're mining under this mountain. The ore comes up in a conveyor belt to the mill. People actually live in this housing there, and they put the tailings way back here, which we'll discuss. And the Goodpaster River is down on the floor here. So this is just another version that shows you where they're mining underground. But let's start. So Meredith suggested that I treat you guys like dirt. So let's start as dirt. That's where it all starts. So you're standing at the face, and that is a vein of ore, which in this case, in Pogo's case, includes some gold in it, but it could include copper or other things. And the first thing you got to do is you got to fluff it up. You have to make it smaller so that the loader can get it. So what they do is they drill, put a little explosive in, and everybody leaves, so I don't have a picture of it, and it goes boom, and collapses. And so first you were bedrock, now you're like, I don't know what, cantaloupes or Volkswagen sizes. And it can either come out by a conveyor belt, or it can come out by trucks. This is actually at Greens Creek. So the next thing they want to do is they want to grind it down to sand to silt size. And they use these grinders. These are larger than underground mines. These are actually at Fort Knox. But let me explain what we're doing here. If you had a boulder that you knew had some gold in it, and you had some chemicals you thought would get the gold out, you'd put the chemicals in the outside of the rock, and you'd have some, a liquid and some gold. Then you go, wait a minute, I didn't get anything in the rock. So you cut it up. Oh, I got this face now, and that face. Well, maybe if I cut it up further, I can get more. And if you grind it down to sand size, then your processing, your chemicals, can get all of it, or almost all of it. So what the first part of mining is just about getting stuff out and grinding it up. So this is the first grinder, and what they do is they put, the ore goes in, just falls on itself, and the weight crushes it. If it doesn't, it just comes out, flow through. If it hasn't been crushed enough, it goes back in again. And it goes to the second grinder, where it's no longer heavy enough to crush itself, so they put in steel balls, which actually are eventually consumed and worn down. And then you have silt and sand-sized particles. So that's your adventure as dirt. But I want to go now we have to process it. And there are three kinds of processing. First, at Fort Knox, they take it off and they process some of it just by water. They run water over it, just like that old guy with, they actually use a centrifuge, but it's essentially similar, just like the old guy with a shovel. But that's not and the heavier stuff falls out. The lighter stuff gets carried away. And the heavier stuff, Fort Knox's case, is gold. Gold's pretty heavy. But that's not a very usual type of processing. Usually big mines, sometimes gold mines will do a little bit of this, but usually they use chemicals. So I'm going to go through three types. Type 1 is water, but it's not that common. Or type 2 is what they call flotation. Now this, in addition to being like a great place for the end of a shoot-'em-up movie, is the mill at Pogo. And each one of these orange mixers is, it's sort of a giant mixer over a big vat. They put chemicals in the vat, and surprisingly, it bubbles up to the surface. And this is what it looks like when it comes to the surface. So that gets out the gold in there, but it also gets out most of the heavy metals, the sulfide metals. So most of the sulfide metals, surprisingly, coat the surfaces of those bubbles, which is why they don't look like soap bubbles, but they functionally are similar. You can't really see, but the bigger sizes would be a little bigger than my fist. But the heavy metals come to the surface, the heads, if you will, and the stuff that's waste that doesn't have the gold and other heavy metals goes to the bottom, tailings. It's waste. It's silt size waste, or things that they're not going to use. Now the efficiency by which that they get the heavy metals out depends on the geochemistry, and sometimes it's really efficient, sometimes it's not. So what's left could have some heavy metals in it, or it could be like beach sand, depending on your mine. So now we have a concentrate, in this case of gold and other stuff. Now for many mines, that's the end, right? They ship it off, they're done, right? That's what they do at Kensington. They ship it off. That's essentially what they do at Red Dog. Pogo has something else. They have a cyanide circuit. Now that isn't, for a lot of mines that aren't gold, they don't use a cyanide circuit, but for gold mines they do. And at Pogo, I'll talk about it a little bit. So this is actually at Fort Knox because it's better pictures. So they mix dilute cyanide. They call it dilute. It'll still kill you. So they have a water and cyanide mixture, and they just, with residence time and mixing, it just goes into 7 vats, one after the other. And when they're done, chemically that pulls the gold out. So you have a water and cyanide and gold mixture, and then you have a third stream of everything else, right? It was all the heavy metals minus the gold. Now, so they take that, I'm going to go to what they do with the tailings afterwards, but they take that gold and, oops, I have it. That's not right. Anyway, they take that gold. Let me stop here. I'm going to do a cyanide. Since cyanide's a big deal, even if it's not likely to be used on a non-gold mine, sometimes it is not likely. let me talk about cyanide. Cyanide has a bad rap, and it has a bad rap in literature, and like these are what? Because it could kill you. These are like the cufflinks that James Bond could wear, so when the Russians capture him, he can eat it and die, which of course he never does, because then they wouldn't be able to make another movie. But it, in relatively low concentrations, can kill you. That's about 200 parts per billion. That's our drinking water standard. The standard for fish is a lot lower. Now you can get cyanide in your system through inhaling it, ingesting it, absorbing it on your skin. And any of you have a medical background, nurse or health aide or doctor, surgeon, whatever? Well, okay, I see one in the back. You know what cyanose means? Cyanose is when your lips turn blue as people are dying, and they do that from lack of oxygen. Same root. What cyanide does is it interferes with your uptake of oxygen. So what happens is that you can suffocate even though there's air all around you. Now, the bad news is it kills you. The good news is that it doesn't really accumulate in your body. It doesn't cause cancer. Your body naturally gets rid of it. You piss it away. So if you take some and you don't die, you're probably fine. These are the major uses in this country are not mining, and I have no idea what they do for cosmetics or food processing or table salt. But it's a relatively common industrial chemical. You see it in lots of products. The major source in the environment is actually incomplete combustion during forest fires. So the good news for those of you who are, unlike me, paying attention in high school chemistry, is cyanide is just carbon and nitrogen. It breaks down very easily. Sunlight, bacteria, it absorbs onto things. So it's broken down by all these things, enzymes and bacteria. Occasionally it can break down into toxic compounds, but usually it's just carbon and nitrogen, things in the air. So here's what I'm trying to get across. I'm not trying to get across that it's not a dangerous chemical. I'm not. It will kill you. But it is a chemical that it can be managed in the environment so that there are natural ways to break it down. So it's in the Fort Knox, when Fort Knox has a little bit in their tailings pond, by the time it goes through the soil, it's mostly gone. So we've done it back to cyanide, but now remember there were three ways. Water, which is not usually used. Cyanide, which is probably not used on deposits that are not gold, so probably not in this valley. And then flotation, which separates the heavy metals, really, from the rest of the metals. And then, of course, you have the gold. In this case, gold. Some cases, it's not. It's whatever, copper, whatever you have. Now, this is the gold button. So this is what they pour at Fort Knox. They do about twice a week. This is at Illinois Creek on an inspection. What happens if you're holding, gold's pretty heavy, so when you grab it, it's heavier than you think. And when you're holding $200,000 or $300,000, what happens is you grin, right? You hate mining, you love mining, you don't care, you're having a bad day, you grin. And, it just turns out that it's sort of amusing to hold that much money. I mean, maybe you guys hold that a lot, I don't. So, we have three methods of processing: water, flotation, remember that creates the heavy metals, and cyanide. So what do we do with the stuff that's left over, the tailings, the things that aren't gold or copper or zinc or whatever? Well, at Pogo, they take the water out. Actually, they have three streams. They have the stream that dropped out of the flotation, right, has some heavy metals taken out of it, and they have the stream that dropped out of the cyanide circuit, which is the heavy metals without the gold. The stuff without most of the heavy metals is dried. They just press the water out, and it's mostly then has the consistency of dirt, and they put it up in the valley. It becomes a landform. Now it's an engineered landform, but it's a landform. It doesn't have a dam. This is what it looks like. Here's we are standing around, and you notice we're not leaving footprints. It's compacted. The car's not leaving tire tracks, but these are the tracks of the cat and the bulldozer. And when they're done, they will crown it so water flows off. It's relatively impervious, so water won't go through it. And they'll put a layer that sheds water, and they'll grow stuff on top, and they'll leave it. It doesn't have a dam, right? And they'll leave it. That's where it goes. So, and this stuff doesn't have a lot in it, right? Doesn't have a lot of things you worry about. Probably has some, but not a lot. But we have a second stream, right? This was the stuff without the heavy metals in it. And we have a second stream, and that's all the stuff that's the bad actors, right? All this heavy metal stuff. Well, what you do with that is they put cement in it, and they put it back right in the mine. They put it back underground where it came from. So that's a relatively clean way of dealing with it. That is, it was underground in a rock when God put it there. They take it out, they take out the gold, they put all the heavy metals back underground where it came from, and they put the stuff that the heavy metals has been cleaned from on the surface of the earth. Now, that's a very clean mines, and some mines are very different, and I'm not suggesting that all mines are like that, but so we've gone through dry stack, we've gone through putting it back underground in cement, and there's one more. This is just a picture of Pogo, the tailings, dry stack tailings, where they press the water out. It's way up here. And I want to go, the third one is tailings lakes. Now, a lot of our mines don't have tailings lakes. They use the dry stack instead. But Fort Knox does, and there's a lot of talk about tailings lakes. And so even if it's not necessarily relevant in this valley, it's worthwhile. You have to understand mines, you have to understand it. So here is Fort Knox, about 10 years ago. That's the start of the tailings lake. And so remember, at Fort Knox, all the stuff that has gone through their mill, gone through the cyanide circuit, it just goes right out into the lake. Now, they don't separate out the heavy metal stuff, but they're a very clean mine. They don't have a lot. It's mostly quartz and silica. They don't have a lot of heavy metals. Some mines do. Red Dog's got a tremendous amount. They don't have an acid problem. Red Dog does. It's very dependent on the mine. So they have water that's reasonably close to water quality standards. It's coming right out of their mill. Doesn't meet water quality standards, but it's close. So if it doesn't meet it, how do we keep it out of the environment? Now, I'm not going to be going over tailings dams. That's why Dave's around. But I want to talk about how they keep it out of the environment. This is the tailings lake at Fort Knox, our tailings dam. It's also the only hydraulic exit to the valley. So if you're water in the valley, you're either flowing down to that spot, or if you're groundwater, you're going under that spot. So we know all the water is either going through that dam, because the dam leaks, the dam leaks, all dams leak, it turns out, or it's going under the dam. Now, to keep that water out of the environment, here's what was happening before anybody built a dam, this cartoon, right? It's a water table, water flows downhill, like water does, in the soil, or even in the bedrock, in cracks in the bedrock. And this would be the water table. It's flowing downhill, so if water's coming that way, it's flowing out. But what they do at Fort Knox is they put a well, actually a series of wells, and they pump it. So they've lowered the water table. So they've created a low spot below the dam. Now, low spots are where water flows to. So all the water, even underground, is going to flow to those spots. And they pump it, and they put it back in the tailings lake. So here's where I'm standing on the Fort Knox Dam, and all of these posts, look like telephone poles, are connected by these white hoses to the pump house, and they're pumping it back. They're taking the water towards back, and it goes in the big pipeline back into the tailings dam. So downstream, they don't see a signature or any water from the tailings lake down this way. Now they monitor the groundwater, they monitor the surface water. Fish and Game monitors the algae, the fish, the benthic environment to make sure there's no effect. And eventually this water will meet water quality standards when the mine's done. So we've got 3 ways of handling the waste. One way is a tailings lake. Maybe not relevant for this valley, but it's still an important way. We'll hear a lot about it. Second is dry stack. And what's in that dry stack kind of depends on the mine. It could be some heavy metals. It could be very few heavy metals. The third way is putting it back underground where it came from. And different ways mines do it is very dependent on the chemistry of the mine and the geology and what's going on. And so I want to do one more thing. This is just the biomonitoring that Fish and Game does. They monitor from top to bottom, they monitor the algae, the aquatic insects, the fish, so that they can understand. They even take the juvenile fish and put them in a lab quality blender and blend them up and see if there are any metals that are taking metals up. So it's a way to see if there's something happening that we don't understand. And so they monitor burbot, grayling, etc. This is, they created this lake downstream of their mine. That's the tailings dam, and that's the pit. So because I'm a part-time professor at UAA, somewhere there's a law that professors have to summarize for the end of class, right? So here's my summary. We've really talked about 3 ways of processing minerals. Water, which isn't a big use. I mean, that's not really what they do a lot in large mines, but it is a way. Flotation, which separates the sulfide, which is usually most of the heavy metals, from the rest of the ore. And a cyanide circuit, which also may not be relevant for this valley. Most of the non-gold mines all use this. And then what do you do with the waste, right? Well, there are 3 ways. You can backfill it underground. Now, it usually won't all fit underground, so you have to put some of it in the dry stack or in the tailings lake. Tailings lake, again, may not be used in this valley. One assumes that for smaller mines, a dry stack would, but I don't know. And so that's my summary. If you can remember those, you'll all pass the course. The last slide is of myself at when I was inspecting the reclamation at Illinois Creek. Those are the waste dumps. And I'm cheating in this picture. So anybody can guess why I'm cheating? I'm kneeling. It's not really that good. But it actually was good reclamation, and it's stuff's growing on it. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I'll get ready for questions when I guess when we're all done. And was I close?
You were 2 minutes, but good. Thanks, Bob.
All right.
All right. Next is Dr. Dave Chambers. He's the director for Center for Science and Public Participation. And he's going to be presenting on tailings storage facilities and the long-term environmental, social, and economic implications of caring for those facilities. And I think we heard you pretty well. If you have any problems, get the mic as close to you.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. What I'd like to do this morning is to talk about tailings dams and why tailings dams are, first of all, different than a dam that you would build for a water supply reservoir. And I'm doing this because I suspect many of you have heard about the tailings dam failure at Mount Poly. It's been in the news, and I do want to address that directly later on, talk about the recommendations that have come out of the study to determine what happened there. But putting waste tailings material behind a tailings dam is probably the most common way of storing long-term tailings, still more common than dry tailings or some of the other methods that are available. So it's the most common. It's where most mines usually start in their analysis. So tailings dams are different than water supply reservoir dams for 2 fundamental reasons. The first one is you have more options in terms of how to do the basic construction than are normally available for a water supply reservoir. And the second one, which I'm going to come back to a little bit, is that where water supply reservoirs are normally built at one shot. You build the whole thing at once. Tailings dams are almost always built in phases. And I would say that ultimately that has some, it raises more chance for quality control issues, because you have to match lining zones and filter zones or liners on the face of the dam, whatever. So what are the construction methods that are available? Well, if you look at this middle one, the one that says down, the downstream, that's the typical way that a water supply reservoir is built, sort of this triangular shape.
Can you get a little closer? Sorry, Dave, the mic really needs.
So that center method, the downstream method, is the way that most water supply reservoirs are constructed. Tailings dams have two additional methods that are typically used. The lower method, called the centerline method, is basically taking your downstream method and cutting that dam in half and building it. And the reason you can do that is because you have a solid or semi-solid material on the other side of that dam. So you're not, where water can't provide any structural support, the tailings can, at least in terms of its buttressing ability. And then there's also a third method that's used called the upstream method. That's the one up on top. And that's where you're actually building your tailings dam segments on top of the tailings themselves. So you're depending almost entirely upon the tailings for structural support as you get bigger and bigger. Why would you want to employ these other methods and not just stick with the downstream method? Well, you can just tell by looking at the drawings that the amount of material you have to move for these other methods is less. And so the cost of the dam is directly proportional to the amount of material you have to move to make the dam. So these other methods are less expensive, and that's why they're employed. And as I said, these dams are almost always constructed in phases. The reason they're constructed in phases is the tailings dams are always constructed either of rock, that's waste rock from the mine itself, or tailing sands, which again come from the production of tailings. So that material isn't all available at the beginning of the mining process. It's available as the mining process moves forward. So it's done in phases, and that's what these different lines you see here represent. So what we see in this slide is a downstream type dam as it is built up in different phases. And here we have a centerline type dam construction. Again, phase 1 is at the top, and you can see the phase 2, 3, and 4 as it comes in. I think Fort Knox has what, 6 or 7 phases? Yeah. And here's the upstream type construction. And you can see how it just sort of steps back. It's not really possible when you're looking at a tailings dam from the outside to tell how it's constructed. You have to go to the drawings to actually see that, because once the tailings are impounded up against it, you can't visually see from the front what it looks like. So let's talk again about some of the advantages and disadvantages, and I'll start with the upstream method, which is that top picture. It's employed because you move the least amount of material to build it, so it's the cheapest type to build, but it's also the least safe in that it's using those tailings themselves as a foundation material to build the dam on. That tailings material is deposited what we call subaqueously, that is, in a slurry, and it contains a lot of water. And when you put weight on wet material like that, it will eventually give. So you're limited usually quite severely by the amount of weight you can place on that type of material. And that's why this type of dam is the least safe, and in fact, statistically, most of the tailings dam failures we see worldwide are associated with this type of construction. The downstream method, the one in the middle, is the most expensive because you're moving the most material, but again, it's also statistically the safest. And then the centerline method, as the name might suggest, is sort of in between the first two. It's moderately expensive because you're still moving a fair amount of material, but it's also moderately safe. So why do tailings dams fail, and when do they fail? I've listed the three most common causes. Those aren't the only three causes, but the most common cause is failure associated with a hydrologic event, which is usually overtopping. That is, the tailings and the water reach a level where they actually spill over the top and erode the dam away. With an active tailings dam, there is usually no spillway, and that's because these dams are designed to hold back contaminated material. You don't want it exiting the tailings impoundment even in a large storm, so these impoundments and their associated reservoirs, as it were, are supposed to contain the largest hydrologic event that the mine could see. But there's a tremendous range in the amount of water that can come out of the sky. We're not talking a factor of 2, we're talking factors of 10 or more usually. So there are numerous cases, unfortunately, where that maximum hydrologic event has been miscalculated and these dams will overtop, and it turns out that that's the most common cause of tailings dam failures. Slope stability failures are the next most common cause, and that's a little more difficult to explain, but think about what would happen if you try to build a vertical wall out of beach sand. It's too steep, and it's going to fall over. So you have to build that sand at a slope where it's stable, and that's basically what's happening with a slope stability failure. The engineering design counts on certain material properties and usually the absence of water in the dam itself, but sometimes the water level for unintended reasons comes up in a dam, and sometimes the material has different characteristics than what the engineers specified, and that generally leads to these type of failures. It's just sort of a natural sliding. And then the third most common failure type is associated with earthquakes, seismic events. So, and again, that's a reason you have to keep most of the dam dry, because when material is saturated with water and it's subjected to shaking, it liquefies. You may have seen, for instance, pictures of the little sand volcanoes in the San Francisco earthquake. And so, I mean, it literally just turns to jelly. And that's why that upstream method is so unsafe, because if you get liquefaction in the tailings underneath an upstream dam, then the whole thing collapses. When do tailings dams fail? Turns out that statistically, the most vulnerable time for a tailings dam is during the operational period of the mine. That's when we see most of the failures. Once they've made it through the operational phase, they no longer have as much, perhaps not any, water behind the tailings dam itself, and the tailings have had some time to consolidate and become more stable. And again, we're not dealing with these water-related events typically then, because the dams do have spillways of some kind at closure. And worldwide, we see approximately a tailings dam failure about once every 8 months worldwide. So what are some of the costs associated with these tailings dam failures? Environmental, social, economic costs. The environmental costs, impacts to aquatic resources and their habitat. If you've seen the pictures of Mount Polly, that's very evident what can happen there. And then when you have an accident like that, no matter how you clean up, there's still a long recovery time associated with that. Social costs, there are a good number of tailings dams that have resulted in failures that have resulted in loss of life. So it does happen. Did not happen, fortunately, at Mount Polly, but it could have. And then something I call loss of place. That is, when an accident like Mount Polly happens, it just changes the whole character of the location for those that are living there, and it doesn't feel the same. So and that's something that seems to stick around for a long time. Economic costs, there's obviously loss of business income. Tourism typically takes a hit, but the mine itself also takes a hit, and quite often companies go bankrupt when they have a big accident like this. And then there's significant taxpayer liability for cleanup. I've got a draft of a paper out right now that looks at a colleague of mine who's a risk analyst and I are looking at tailings dams failures and both the rate of failures and not so much from an engineering standpoint what causes them, but what economic indicators seem to be associated with this. And what we found, to make a long story short, was that as we mine lower grade ore bodies, we create more waste, which means bigger tailings impoundments. So what we're seeing is an increase in the number of large impoundment failures, while the number of smaller impoundment failures are going down. So all three of those dam types that I talked about are susceptible to failures. Here's an example of an upstream dam, and again, you can't tell it's upstream by looking at it from this perspective, but this is one in South Africa that failed due to overtopping. They just got too much water in it. It went over the top of the dam, and once it started eroding, the whole thing went. Here's an example of a downstream type dam in Spain that failed. It was due to a foundation failure, which was basically the same cause that got Mount Polly. There was a clay layer down beneath this structure, and as they continued to load the dam, that is, build the dam itself higher and put tailings behind it, it put more pressure on that layer, and it's what I kind of call the banana peel effect. That is, if you got a banana peel laying out here and your dog walks out and puts its paw on it, it's probably not going to slip out from under the dog because the dog doesn't weigh enough. But if you or I go step on that thing, we probably weigh 5 times or more than what the dog does, then it's going to slip. And that's basically what happened with this dam and with Mount Polly, as they continued to load that dam higher and higher with both dam construction and with tailings behind it. The weight just got too much for that slick layer, and it slipped. And then here's a picture of Mount Polly. Mount Polly was primarily what's called a centerline dam. And again, it was just due to a foundation failure. I want to talk a bit about the findings of the expert panel from Mount Polly. First of all, their recommendations, and this was a 3-person panel, 3 very respected, well-qualified engineers that looked at the failure causes and then made some recommendations to the government of British Columbia, which commissioned them to do this study. So the first thing they said is that safety should drive dam design, not cost, because quite frankly, right now, cost drives dam design. That's why we have these centerline and upstream structures, because they're less expensive to build. They also said no more wet tailings closures, that is, especially for acid generating material like we see at Red Dog and Greens Creek. The most effective way to protect that material from oxidation, acid generation, and the metal generation associated with that is to put it underwater. And that basically denies oxygen to it. So putting it in a lake, sometimes literally, is the best way to prevent acid generation. But what the panel said was, when you have these wet closures, there's too much risk associated with the potential failure. So even if it results in more water treatment, they're recommending a dry closure for all tailings facilities. And in fact, they even go on in the report to say they recommend that all tailings facilities be closed so that they do not depend on external structures for their long-term structural integrity. Another way to say that is all tailings dams are going to fail, and so the only way to prevent tailings dams failures is to not build tailings dams. Now that doesn't mean that a dry stack can't fail. It can, because it can get saturated and have these same type of slope failures or seismic failures. But the problem with the wet closure, and we saw that in both of the, actually in all the examples I showed you there, those were all failures with tailings ponds that were overfilled with water for one reason or another. And when you have a dam failure with that much water, it mobilizes all those tailings and sweeps them downstream. If you have a failure of a dry closure, you'll have a structural failure, but at least you can pick the stuff up pretty close to the source and put it back. And that's significantly different. The panel recommended that the industry make use of best available technologies, best available practices, things like dry tailings, independent review panels for each large dam, more prescriptive regulatory standards. I can give you an example of that if you like. And then finally, the panel said that it firmly rejects any notion that business as usual can continue. So here are three of the preeminent people in the field of tailings dam engineering saying we're not doing it right, we've got to change. And that's pretty sobering. So I'll leave it at that, and like Bob, we'll take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Chambers. Just a reminder, we have these sheets of that on the table, and they have all their names and information, contact information. So you have their contact information from these gentlemen now in case we don't get all the questions later. But no. Okay. So next presentation is with three individuals, and up first is John Hoppy. He's a geologist with BLM, and then following him will be James Whitlock, and then Kyle Moselle with the state. So, John.
John's information isn't on the contact list.
Right, John. Yeah, you won't see John's name here. He was kind of the last. He just decided to come on.
In your email address. Here,
But I hear you guys sit right next to each other, so maybe you can.
Yeah.
But Meredith has his contact information too.
And I think James put some flyers on the back table that have the BLM website, web information, and there's a lot of contact information on that too.
Yeah, as close as you want from my side.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, good morning. Thanks for being here. Again, my name is John Hoppy. I'm a geologist. I work in Anchorage. And maybe wondering why BLM is here, because, well, there's no offices nearby. But BLM in Alaska kind of has three parts that pertain to this area. One is the BLM administers all the federal mining claims, or mining claims on federal lands, so that's with Forest Service and BLM lands. When someone stakes a mining claim, they file the mining claim with the BLM, and we maintain the records and make sure that they make payments and do all their filings to maintain the claim. Also, we do the conveyance of federal lands to Native corporations and villages, as well as to the state. And we also, the BLM manages 72 million acres of public lands in Alaska. And you can see on this map, that's all those bright green areas. MPRA is that big green blotch on the north slope there. We also manage the 6,700 acres that are within the mining claims that are leased to Constantine Metals. Those have been selected by the state, but as long as those federal claims are in place, it remains federal land and managed by the BLM. So I'm going to cover mining law a little bit. It's one law that's 143 years old and still on the books. And a little bit about surface use laws, and then James is going to cover the fun part of trying to go through the BLM regulatory and permitting process. All right, mining law 1872. Very interesting story about how that came about way back in the day. 1872, what was going on? Well, we just finished up the Civil War. Government was kind of trying to get some more funds to the government to pay for our bills from the war. And they're trying to, initially there's laws that they wanted to put royalties and such on mining operations. And there's several competing ideas on how to manage mineral rights. Well, the new senator from Nevada was working in the gold rush of 1849 in California, and he helped write a mining law for the local mining district. And when he became the senator and they were looking for a mining law, he brushed off his copy. And that essentially became the mining law that's been on the books ever since. Okay, the first couple, well, the laws back then were great. They were super long sentences with lots of clauses thrown in there. But the first clause there, all valuable mineral deposits in lands belonging to the United States, both surveyed and unsurveyed, shall be free and open to exploration. And then it says where they're found, the lands are open to occupation and purchase. And that last bit is pretty important, under regulations prescribed by law. So I'm going to distill 143 years worth of case law into 3 sentences because the mining law has been amended. You can no longer purchase, well, it's still the law, you can purchase your mining claims, but it's unfunded, so there's a moratorium on patenting and mining claims. So currently, a person who makes a discovery of a valuable metallic mineral deposit on public land that is not close to mining for some reason, a person may stake a claim to the minerals. And then they must record their claim that they've made with the local recorder's office, that'd be with the state, and then they have to file a copy of that with the BLM. So then every year to maintain that claim, they have to either pay a fee, a maintenance fee, or do physical labor actually improving or developing that mining claim. So once that mining claim has been staked, recorded, and filed and accepted by the BLM as everything being in order and proper, that person or company now owns the minerals within that mining claim. It's a property right. they've, through self-initiation, now own those minerals. And going back to the Constitution, they can't be deprived of that ownership without due process. Okay, so that mineral right, you can sell it, you can lease it, you can it can be inherited. It's an ownership. But as that last line comes in there, under regulations prescribed by law. So they have the right, they own those minerals, but the right to develop those minerals has to be in accordance with the laws and regulations of the United States. Okay. So earlier in the century, most mining laws pertain to what you could mine, what you could extract. There's the sellable minerals where you had to then buy sand and gravel, but you couldn't put a mining claim on sand and gravel anymore. But in 1969, there's the National Environmental Policy Act, which basically said that when the government made an action or a decision of some sort, that we had to weigh environmental factors equally with other factors in a decision. So it's kind of, they called it the Magna Carta of environmental laws, because for the first time they're talking about how resources were developed. So then agencies were required to analyze a range of alternatives, and an important part is include the public in the decision-making process. Another, as far as BLM's involvement, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, based in '76, they decided how they want to develop public resources. And unlike the National Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, where they have a mandate to protect a resource, the BLM has a multiple use mandate, meaning we're to allow multiple uses of public lands while preserving, protecting the environment and promoting sustainable yield. And it's also called the BLM Organic Act, because that kind of laid the framework for BLM regulations. And now Mr. Whitlock is going to kind of take that framework established in FLTMA and how it was converted into regulations and is now carried out by the BLM. James? Oh.
Hello again, my name is James Whitlock with the BLM. I'm a acting program lead kind of for the mining program, but an environmental scientist. Yes?
Can you move it closer?
Yep.
I don't hear you very well.
Is this better?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Up close. I work with the BLM in their mining compliance division, and so I'm going to talk about the BLM's process for permitting a mine through the process to where they can actually start developing. I'm also going to explain how the BLM classifies different mining activity that can happen. So following on with John's presentation, we discussed the mining law said that they're allowed to extract their minerals, but under the regulations prescribed by law. So we have the National Environmental Policy Act, which gives us guidance on how we need to analyze the impacts on the environment and include the public in that process. We have the Federal Land Policy Management Act, which is kind of our guidance document for the BLM on how we're going to do this management for multiple use. And we call the Federal Land Policy, FLTMA, we call it FLTMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act. And in there, it requires that all those activities prevent unnecessary and undue degradation to the lands. So with the mining law, with FLTMA, with the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, all those provide the kind of framework to establish the regulations that the mining company has to follow in order to operate on BLM public lands. So we have the surface management regulations. That regulation is very specific to the mining activity, how mining will be conducted and what's required of the mining company. And then we have use and occupancy regulation, which really covers the activities, the structures and facilities that would be incident to a mining operation, such as a power line or a power plant, or the buildings that have to be built to, have to house your personnel, to have a mill, those things. Those are separate activities and they're covered under a separate set of regulations. So in this conversation, we're really going to focus on the surface management component. What is required of the operator to do? And believe me, I understand regulation is a dry topic, so I'll try to make this as easy as possible, and just bear with me. So the surface management regulations are very complicated, just like everything that typically the government likes to write. And so they wrote the Surface Management Handbook in 2012, the BLM published it, and it kind of helps break down this process and helps explain the surface management regulations. So surface management had a last major revision in 2001, and it's really kind of the document we're going to be focusing on in today's discussion, and then we have use and occupancy in the handbook. So UUD, this is that phrase I mentioned earlier, unnecessary and undue degradation to the environment. Really was mandated, was kind of initiated in under the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and is the key component in the surface management regulations. It's kind of the nexus that ties all these regulations and the mining law and all these things together, is that we are required to make sure that the mining company does activities that prevent unnecessary and undue degradation to the environment. And how do we do that? Well, there's obviously some of the more obvious things. They just can't blatantly destroy the environment, and they have to be incident to the level of activity that they're going to be doing. But the regulations spell out performance standards that the mining company must meet in order to stay in compliance and not cause unnecessary and undue degradation. So those performance standards, there's 13 of them in the regulations. Those 13 performance standards, I don't have them all listed up there right now. Some of them have multiple subparts that break down. But essentially they identify criteria that must be met. So reclamation, it spells out that reclamation must be done. It must have revegetation. It gives those criteria. Access routes, it says that fish and water resources must be rehabilitated. That's a key word I want to explain here. There's a difference between rehabilitation, reclamation, and restoration. So reclamation is not restoration. It's not returning it to the original land state. It's to a land state that is usable for the post-land use, whatever that post-land use is going to be. So, and then also performance standards require that we have compliance with other laws. So that's local laws, that's state laws, that's federal laws. They have to comply with the Clean Air Act. They have to comply with State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation laws, and they also have to comply with local laws that maybe the Haines community has as part of their regulatory or their law process. So every operation that involves larger mining level activity has to comply with the performance standards. The regulations spell out 3 types of mining activity that are allowed on BLM public lands. The first one is casual use, which most of us, and I would encourage you to do this, is get out with a gold pan and a shovel and go have and experience the joys of gold panning on public lands. It's a recreational activity. It's get out there with your family and your kids and you have fun. Yes, ma'am.
Could you slow down your speech, please?
Yes, ma'am.
I can't keep up with your speech. Slow it down a little bit, because I can't. I'm 72 and 74 and 80-year-old people here. We can't keep up with your fast talking. I don't know what you're trying to say.
I'll give you a little extra time. He
Okay.
has a little extra time.
I'll slow it down. Sorry. I have a lot of material to get through, and I'll slow it down. Sorry about that. So we have casual use, which is where you can go out on the land and gold pan for fun. That's recreational.
Okay.
We have the notice that the regulations require is for exploration only, where you're actually going out on the ground and you're drilling holes or trenching, and you're trying to find out how much of the resource is in the ground. This is where you're trying to find out, is it economical to develop this resource? And then the last one we have is a plan of operations, and this is where mining actually happens. So there's 3 kinds of activity. We're going to talk about notices and plans because casual use is exactly that. It's just casual recreational use. A notice, what is it? A notice is exploration only. You're exploring the resource, the geology, to find out if it is worthwhile. There are limitations, the regulations require that it be 5 acres or less of total surface disturbance. It has to be a bulk sample of the presumed ore of 1,000 tons or less. There's certain areas where notices do not apply, such as a wild and scenic river. One of the key things to take home here today is that notices do not require review under the National Environmental Policy Act process. That is because to stay consistent with the mining law, the mining company needs to be able to get out on the ground as quickly as possible and decide, is it even worth their time and money and the government's time and money and the public's time to develop the resource. So exploration is intended, a notice is intended to get the mining company on the ground as quickly as possible, and they do that work. They can renew that notice for 2 years, but they have to stay within that 5-acre limitation, and they must stay within that 1,000-ton bulk sample process. They can't exceed those to comply with the conditions of a notice. What is required for a notice? First thing you have to do to be allowed to operate under a notice of operations is you have to contact your nearest BLM office. And then you need to provide a narrative on how your operation will be conducted and how you will meet those performance standards, the 13 performance standards that the regulations spell out. If you can show that your operation is going to do those things, then there's a high likelihood that you're going to prevent unnecessary and undue degradation. In addition to that, you have to submit a reclamation plan that describes how you're going to reclaim your drilling sites or your trenching sites. And lastly, you have to provide a financial guarantee or a bond where you essentially are providing money on what it would cost to perform reclamation on the site if the BLM had to do that reclamation and go out and do it for you as defined in your reclamation plan. So all that information, that detail, the BLM would get it, and we concur with that activity, and the operation's allowed to continue the exploration for 2 years, and then they're allowed to renew that process again. They have to do the process over again every 2 years. So you've done your exploration, you've drilled holes, and you've determined that this is a valuable resource and you want to mine it. Or you're doing your exploration and you have pushed past, or you're about to pass your 5-acre or 1,000-ton threshold. So there's kind of a key there. It's either you're still doing an exploration, it's just your exploration project has grown, or you're actually ready to start mining. Then you submit a plan of operations. And a plan of operations, again, requires that you prevent unnecessary and undue by meeting performance standards, but there's considerable more detail and requirements in a plan of operations. It does require the National Environmental Policy Act. Requirements are applied to a plan of operations, so it has to be analyzed and public input is involved throughout the whole process. Of course, it must be bonded as well. So what exactly is required for a plan of operations? This is just an example of some of the information, but there is a lot more information that is not listed here. But some of the key things is how are you going to manage your water on the site? Not just your wastewater, but all your water. How is your fresh water going to be handled? How is your drinking water for all of your employees going to be handled? Of course, most importantly probably is how is your waste stream of water going to be handled? Those are the components that fall under there. What measures will you take to isolate your tailings, your chemicals, those kind of things, acid rock drainage. And a reclamation cost estimate, and this is a key thing also, because reclamation is a design of what the mine site's going to look like when you're done mining. The reclamation plan says this is how we're going to close out our mine site when we're done. So the reclamation cost estimate says this is how much it's going to cost to do this work, so that if the company is unable to do the work at some point, the BLM, the agencies, can take the money that was provided in that bond, that financial assurance, and apply it to the ground and actually make that work happen and close and reclaim the site. So once you've taken all the information, you've compiled all these plan components, and they range everywhere from a very small operation like a placer mine would maybe just have a very small document, to large mines like Kensington or Greens Creek are multiple volumes big of mine plans that describe how they're going to do all this. The BLM receives that, and then we do a completeness review right off the bat, and the completeness review is only looking at does the proposed mine plan meet all the components of the regulations. And if it does, then we move forward into the next step, the National Environmental Policy Act review. If it doesn't have all the required information, we send it back through the process, and they have to modify and change it to meet our regulations. So internally, we receive the document and we start the NEPA process. And with that, there's a requirement that we involve the public in multiple phases throughout the project, so that you can actually review the mine plan, you can see what the BLM is looking at doing, and provide input and your ideas and suggestions on that process. It's a public process. It's the reason the National Environmental Policy Act was created, is to allow the public to be involved in federal actions and decisions. Again, a notice of exploration is not a federal action. There's no decision, so there's no NEPA associated with it, whereas in a plan there is. So you have the complete plan submitted, we go through the process, and we're going to produce one of two documents. And I don't have the time to go through how the whole process works on getting to these documents, but you're going to produce either an environmental assessment document or an environmental impact statement. Just know that an environmental impact statement is a much more complicated document, larger time frames, and a higher associated cost with that document. But at the end of whatever document you produce for analyzing this decision, the BLM is going to decide as a decision to allow the activity with conditions of approval. So we're going to say you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and that's collaboratively developed, working with the community, with other regulators, working with the mining company, and we develop those that mine plan, and they move into development and mining. So once they're approved to go out there, they get on the ground, they can start developing their mine and developing the resource. And the BLM, we transfer into more of a compliance and enforcement role. We're going to go out on the ground and do compliance inspections to make sure that you're actually doing what the approved mine plan says you're supposed to be doing. And are you complying with your permits and other stipulations that were placed on your mine plan? And the intent is not to go out there and constantly look for ways to shut down mines. The intent is to get out there and work with the mining companies and identify more efficient ways of doing things, or identifying deficiencies and correcting them before they become something major. And so that's where an enforcement action comes in. If an error is identified, if there's some kind of deficiency in the way they're performing operations, then we would write a non-compliance. And the non-compliance just identifies, here's the mistake you've made, here's how you need to fix it, and this is what you have to report to us to show that you fixed it. Lesson learned, don't do it again, carry on. Everybody makes mistakes, all industries make mistakes, and that's what we use non-compliance for. But as the severity or repetition of those compliance issues increase, the BLM has the authority to move up a scale to where ultimately we do have the authority for plan revocation, where we could close the mine plan out, and we could also take forfeiture of the bond, where we could take the financial guarantee and do the closure of the mine site if necessary. So this process, though, starting from when the mine plan submitted, as we move along through the National Environmental Policy Act process, and then including through the mining itself, when we're doing compliance and enforcement, is a collaborative effort with the Department of Natural Resources, large mine permitting team, and all of the state agencies. And so next I'll turn it over to Kyle, and he's going to talk about how the state of Alaska's process fits into the BLM's process for getting mine plans approved.
Hey, John, can you bring up my one slide? Hi, Gunesh Chish. Thank you for letting me, allowing me to speak with you today about mining and how the state of Alaska works to regulate mining. Again, my name's Kyle Moselle. I'm with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. I'm in the Office of Project Management and Permitting, which is the center circle of my very complicated but single slide for my presentation. A couple things. First, the term large mine, it's in the name of the group I lead, the large mine permit team. But I want to clarify that it's not a regulatory term. And so we generally refer to a mine as a large mine when it's a hard rock mine or a lode mine, so not placer mine. It's also, that term applies usually when the mining project has more than 5 acres of surface disturbance. When they need to, when the mine or the project needs to discharge water to the environment, treated or otherwise. When they need to manage waste rock or tails, or when there's multiple state or federal authorizations, permits that are required for them to do the activities that they want to do. All of those will generally cause me to start referring to that project as a large mine. My presentation here is on two basic things, but complex things. The state's coordinated permitting process, and also opportunities for public involvement in that process. And so what I've done is I've created a visual, because I know we learn in different ways, and there's been a lot of language and words presented, very good information by the other presenters, and so I've taken just a different approach and put it in a visual aid so you can kind of see the complexity of the permitting process. Starting from the center, again, is my Office of Project Management and Permitting. We are not a regulatory agency. I don't issue any permits or have any regulatory authority. My role is to help the regulatory agencies work together in a coordinated fashion to regulate or permit mining. And so surrounding my circle on this diagram are the state agencies, Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and others. And then the boxes that come out from those circles are the individual permits or authorizations that each of those organizations have jurisdictional authority, statutory authority. They have laws to write those permits and authorizations. The boxes that are outlined in red are those authorizations that have a legal requirement for public notice and comment. There are a few that are not outlined in red because there isn't a legal requirement for public notice, but they still get publicly noticed. One of them that's most notable is the reclamation plan issued by the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. And that one is publicly noticed along with the waste management permit, which does have a legal requirement for notice. And so we work those together because they are tied together through the financial assurances, the bonding that has to be approved by both Department of Natural Resources and Department of Environmental Conservation. And so I hope that this model that I've created here impresses upon you all that there's no single permit to mine, and there's many authorizations required from many state agencies for a large mine to be approved and to go into production. Coordination creates efficiencies in this complex network. The efficiencies that are most notable to me is earlier identification of concerns. Creative solutions or problem solving can be achieved in a coordinated approach rather than several single agency reviews of the proposed activity. And there's less duplication. So instead of 5 or 6 or 7 agencies looking at the project through their own regulatory lenses, we can bring them together in this coordinated team approach, facilitated, that's what I do, and we can look at the project together, and we can build off of each other's individual expertise and have a synergy, if you will, created through that coordinated approach. Lastly, the coordination is a voluntary program. A mine project or a mine proponent is not required to seek coordination from my office. It's a voluntary process. Other options besides what's represented here is they could hire an environmental firm to do their permitting, to coordinate with all the individual agencies for the permits that are required. They could also do it in-house if they choose. All the operating mines, there's 5 of them in Alaska, currently opt into this voluntary coordinated process that's headed up by Alaska Department of Natural Resources. So I think that speaks to its success and its value. And lastly, it's a we use a user pays model. So the mining companies that opt into this coordinated permitting process with the state of Alaska, they pay for the service. And so what that looks like is the mining company or the project proponent will enter into a funding agreement with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, and then Alaska Department of Natural Resources will enter into reimbursable service agreements with the participating agencies like Fish and Game and DEC and the others. And then as expenditures are incurred by the agencies as they work through this team approach, those billings go back to the project proponent, and the project proponent remits payment, and then those payments reimburse the general fund. And that is what I will talk about, and I look forward to the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Just a reminder, all these presentations and slides are going to be available through Talk Chinook. She's going to put them on the website or make them available to whoever wants to look at the slides later. And our final presenter before our break is Guy Archibald. And he's a Mining and Clean Water Program Manager with Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. So one more 20-minute presentation, and then we'll take a little break before we go into questions and discussion. Okay?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm batting cleanup here, so I would like to thank Klukwan and the tribe for inviting us to your territory. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Talk Chinook Watershed Council for facilitating this discussion as well. So I have 2 goals here. One is to bring the people kind of back into this process and highlight that. And I'm going to go up to about a 30,000 foot level here because there is no plan of operations currently for a large mine in this valley. So there's nothing specific right now to respond to. But I do want to talk about the balancing of risk and benefits and how that analysis needs to go. How many people here have ever decided on a nice sunny day not to jump into your car and drive because you might get into a car accident? So how many people here today have auto insurance? So obviously, you don't have to have 0 risk in order to do something. Every day of our lives, we operate under a certain level of risk. And that needs to be, kept into thought here as we go, if we go forward, on a large mine. So right now, I imagine everybody is at this point. And if a large mine was to submit a plan of operations and the permitting process start in this valley, I can guarantee you that this is going to get worse and not better. And I'm certainly not going to clarify any of this in the next 19 minutes. But it's actually a good place to be this early in the process, because the mine company is going to have to justify their actions. The regulators are going to have to justify their decisions. If you're at the point, for whatever reason, that you are just saying no to mining in this valley, you will have to justify that decision. So you're going to have to get into the weeds of the mine plan and the permitting to find the places to make the comments, to be part of the process, to justify your concerns. So it's good to be, a little confused and not have your minds made up. So again, it's all about balancing. And one of the key concepts I want to get through is looking at the scale of things. Oftentimes, we look at fish in a creek or a wetland, and we don't see the larger scale of decisions. Oftentimes in a time frame, we tend to look at maybe benefits over the life of a mine, how much employment there will be over the life of the mine. But the impacts from that project may exceed the life of the mine. You may have perpetual water treatment, perpetual maintenance of structures and tailing piles. So you have to take a time frame that may be a little larger. Also, there's a spatial, how much space is that scope going to be? Oftentimes the analysis is at the footprint of the mine itself. But are you looking at watershed scale impacts, landscape scale impacts? You have to keep in mind the scale of a lot of things. If a mine was to go forward and go through the regulating process, they're going to identify the certain values that may be needed to look at. So for these values, for protecting these values, it's really important that you look at not just the expected lifetime of the project, but the expected lifetime of the project's impacts. That's very critical. And nowadays with modern mining, and I'll get into it a little further, oftentimes there's perpetual maintenance or perpetual water treatment or maintenance of tailings dams. So that's the kind of the scale that really needs to be talked about. Okay, in a large mines, what we're talking about, there's not only difference between placer mines and small mines, but there's a difference between historic large mining and modern large mining. And this is very much a generalization here, comparing these two. No two mines are alike. The Kennecott mine, some of its grade was up to 70% copper, very high grade. Certainly over the life of the mine, the overall grade was a lot lower. Greens Creek mine, for an example, makes very good money mining ore for silver that's as low as 0.16% silver. Very smaller amount of concentration. Greens Creek also produces zinc and lead in a separate circuit. As do most modern mines, they're multi-metallic. The difference here is the amount of waste that's produced. And waste just isn't tailings. Waste is waste rock. That's the rock that doesn't have a valuable level of minerals in it in order to justify crushing it, which is the big expense, and milling it to try to get the ore out. But the waste rock is very much something that has to be contained often and mitigated and dealt with. And mines tend to be many little cities, you know, self-contained cities, so they have all the waste streams a normal city would have. So modern mining oftentimes deals with a lot lower grade ore than historical mines do. In order for them to be economical, they tend to have to go very large. You have to move a lot more tonnage in order to produce the same amount of profit on a lower grade ore body. So they tend to be very large. In order to go very large, they require a massive amount of capital monies to go in to purchase the equipment necessary for a very large mine. The markets for commodities, what the mine is going to get for selling its concentrate, nowadays in the modern world is very volatile. We are a connected world now, so what happens in Russia or what happens in Argentina can very quickly, almost on an hourly basis, affect the price of that commodity. So there's lots of uncertainty moving forward. Modern mines oftentimes will require perpetual maintenance. If you have a tailings dam, it has to be generally maintained forever. Water treatment forever. And because now that this temporal scale has gotten so large, many of the technologies used are unproven over the long period of time. There's a lot of advancements in tailings liners or pond liners. But will they last for hundreds of years? We don't know yet. They're certainly designed to, but in the real world. So kind of looking at economy of scale, size matters. And size matters more than just the amount of waste that might be produced. And as an example, I'll use, say you have an elephant for a house pet rather than a dog. If you just had a dog for a house pet and your salary went down 10%, your dog's not going to be too worried about it. He's still going to get fed. But if you have an elephant for a house pet and you lose 10% of your salary, that elephant's probably going to starve to death. When mine companies or anything else goes very large and very complex, they lose flexibility. The market for their metals may go down. The ore body they get into may be a lower grade. The cost of personnel or consumables may go up quite a bit. And large, very heavily capitalized companies have a hard time being flexible in those instances. So if you go through the process, if it happens here, there's going to be reams and reams and reams of words. And we have to pay attention very closely to how those words are defined and how they fit into the large scale of things. And I could pull from many examples, but I'm going to use this one. These are the words, if you're concerned about salmon, and somewhere in the regulations you have these words that the activity will prevent significant adverse environmental impacts to fisheries, water quality, and water quantity, and will maintain the present and continued productivity of those salmon streams, that would make you feel a lot better. But these are the words that came out of ANILCA, somewhat paraphrased, 505A. As an example, and again, it's hard to compare areas, this was the kind of regulation for the Greens Creek mine operating in the Admiralty Island National Monument. In 2013, they applied for a permit to expand their tailings pile, and the preferred alternative identified was to fill in an anadromous salmon stream. Would they have been allowed to do that given that this was the standard? And the answer was yes, probably, because the Forest Service, the land manager for that, looked at the word significant adverse effect. And they blew it up to a scale and said that particular salmon stream, compared to all of the salmon habitat on the entirety of Admiralty Island, probably wasn't a significant impact if you destroyed that. They did not identify what would be a significant impact. Now, the tailings expansion into the salmon stream was denied. It was basically the Forest Service punted on it all and only gave them a short term, allowing them to make the current tailings pile larger. But it was denied for a whole variety of reasons. And then down at the bottom, I highlighted to the maximum extent feasible. Unfortunately, maximum extent feasible often boils down to whether it's economical to do that mitigation. So there's going to be a lot of data. They're going to identify going into the, and it can be a public process. The public can help identify values out there. The values may be water quality, water quantity, fisheries values, cultural and traditional values. These values are all going to have to be quantified. And it's tough to do that. It's tough to quantify the value of traditional and cultural practices. It's tough to quantify the value of lifestyle within a community and economic stratification type things. It's hard to objectify and put a dollar value on those things. But indeed, it has to be done because it's going to have to be mitigated. They're going to have to try to make up for any impacts to those of equal value. So it becomes very much a value judgment. They're going to collect a lot of data, And the problem with a lot of data is oftentimes it doesn't lead to increased insight. Just because you have a lot of data, sometimes your insight doesn't increase proportionally. So we need to, it gets weedy, but you have to get into the data. And this is the last time I'll talk about big data. But there's limits to data. And again, this is part of scale. You need to be aware of the limits to gathering data. In the bigger picture, you can never know everything there is to know about, say, an aquatic habitat. It's just way too complex. And then again, you get into this objective versus subjective values, trying to put a dollar value, trying to objectify something that's a subjective value. It's very difficult. How much data is enough data? If they're looking at, say, stream flow in the river, they analyze it, they measure it for 5 years, say, or 6 years. But we know that the El Nino cycles that affect stream flow fluctuate about on a 7-year cycle. So maybe they do it 7 years, 10 years. Well, we also know the Pacific Ocean, that tends to affect stream flows, fluctuates on a 20-year cycle. So how much data is enough data in order to get a good idea what's going to go on in that river over the life of the mine and over the lifetime of those impacts? How is the data used? How is it modeled? So oftentimes what happens is it's a lot of data. They have to be able to predict far into the future. So we use software. We use algorithms so that we can model that data, put in inputs, and then extrapolate it out to the future. And there's software available to do that. And it could be software on fish, water quality, water quantity, a lot of different things. If it's a smaller project, then they might use Risky Project Lite. One example of a software, and I just pulled this out of one of them, this one is for fish return. So basically, you've gathered a ton of data. You have maybe thousands of data points. But when you get into the model, you generally have one box to fill in as an input. And you can put in an average. Sometimes they use 85th percentile or 90th percentile. Oftentimes they'll run the model more than once at one level and then at another level. It gets very complex, but the point is all of that data has to be crunched down maybe into an average or an 80th percentile. Averages and 80th percentiles don't necessarily reflect what's going on out there, because oftentimes range is what is important. As kind of a trite example, say I invite your grandmother over to my house to sit in a room and visit with me for 2 hours. And I'm going to keep that room at an average temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit because grandmothers seem to like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. What I don't tell you is for the first hour, I'm going to keep it at 0 degrees, and for the second hour, I'm going to keep it at 140 degrees. That can be an example of the problem when you take a large amount of data and you have to crunch it into one box. The opposite, actually, of that example of averaging is something called the 100-year flood. And this goes with seismic and earthquake activity as well. They're somewhat analyzed on what's called a return period. And the return period is the amount of time that passes on average between consecutive events of a similar magnitude in a given location, the 100-year flood. And it's a point of confusion a lot of times, because when they say 100-year flood, you're basically saying there's a 1% chance, 1 out of 100, of that flood occurring in any given single year. But what that actually translates to is people confuse absolute values with average values and short-term effects over long-term effects. That 100-year flood, when you look at it as a probability, is actually saying that there's a 64% chance of that 100-year or greater flood occurring during that 100 years. And they can be, as random things tend to work, they can be in real short duration for one another. For instance, the river I grew up on, it flooded a 200-year flood in 1964. In 1973, it did a 100-year flood. And then in 2013, it did another 100-year flood. So in my lifetime, I've seen 2 100-year floods and a 200-year flood on that very river, and I'm not that old. So rare events. The only time you can predict risk with any level of certainty is inside a casino. Outside of the casino, it's very hard to predict risk. And we have other things happening. If they go through a NEPA analysis, one of the alternatives they identify is the no action alternative. They'll look at the entire environment and they'll say, okay, if we do nothing, what happens? And nothing happens, they'll say. But that's not necessarily true, because everything changes. That no action alternative will still, there'll still be impacts. There'll be impacts due to climate change and things like that. Rare events can occur in commodity markets as well. Certainly 3 Mile Island going off was a very rare event that affected the uranium oxide market. It actually put me out of a job back in the day. We tend to focus, and there's a lot of concern about the very rare effects of a catastrophic failure like a dam breaking. But life is very resilient. Natural systems are very resilient. Given enough time to heal, say hundreds of years maybe or thousands of years, a river system can recover from a tailings dam failure. It will recover. We've had volcanic events that are many times that magnitude. They tend to recover. And not only do they recover, but they tend to come back stronger. There's a reason we have 5 species of anadromous salmon over here on the west coast that's very seismically active versus 1 species of salmon on the east coast where they don't have volcanoes and earthquakes and things. Those large-scale impacts actually help nature diversify. It's actually good for nature to some extent, again, given enough time to heal in between. Another example is if you break a bone, it comes back stronger. If you stress a muscle, it comes back larger. Nature is very resilient at long-term impacts, and it's because it's so closely connected to one another. You've heard of the 7 degrees of separation, maybe, between one person and another random person in the world. Kevin Bacon was some weird example that came up. But basically they say that any random person in the world is connected to another random person in the world by only 7 degrees of people in between. Your brother's carpenter's baker knows the roommate of so-and-so, and they know that person. In nature, all the species on average are only separated by 2 degrees. As the indigenous people know and have always known, it's very close, small world. So when you affect one species, you can very quickly affect other species down the road. But again, it's resilient. These little critters out there on the edge that only have one connection, if they go extinct, not much happens. Species go extinct every year. The system doesn't collapse. But like that red one in the middle that happens to be a flounder that's connected to everything in that aquatic system, if you make that extinct and then some of the other ones around it, the fabric of that network can break down very quickly. And I know I'm running out of time here. Given this close connectivity, you can have very, quick effects go on. But the real killer of a natural system is low-level stress, low-level continuous stress. You know what low-level continuous stress does to you, to your digestive system, to your nervous system, to your immune system. It's very damaging. It's not necessarily the occasional high impact. Just sitting on a couch doing nothing is bad for you. As we know, you turn into a couch potato. So the real killer in natural systems is low-level stress. And that's what we tend to need to focus on more than sometimes the high-level, hard-to-predict big impacts. And you don't see a big raft of dead fish floating down the river. And so it's easy to miss the low-level stress on an aquatic ecosystem. So my summary here is, if a mine plan is submitted and the permitting process starts out, you have to become involved. You have to look at things at the bigger picture and scale of things. You have to know the limits, because you're going to be presented with a lot of data that oftentimes doesn't show the limits. It's hard to visualize something that's not there. So you have to be aware that some of this is limited. You have to become kind of the science, and I put that in quotes, experts of your watershed, because you have to have skin in the game. And as another general example, back in the Roman days, they didn't have engineering universities. They didn't have building codes. They didn't have inspectors and regulators. They had a simple rule. If you're the engineer or contractor and you built something, you're also required to build your home and raise your family underneath it or downstream of it. They required you to have skin in the game. And some of those structures the Romans built many thousands of years ago still stand to this day. That's the power of getting your skin in the game. And so I would encourage everybody to keep an open mind, ask experts when you're hammered with all this data, the people at this table, some of the people in the crowd here that can introduce themselves. But keep an open mind, analyze the data, and respond appropriately. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, those are the presentations. Just a couple reminders real quick. Pat wanted to let you know, don't forget to sign in. And there's evaluations back there to let us know if we should do this differently or better next time, since hopefully this isn't just the first of these type of meetings. And don't forget to submit your questions back there, and we'll start going through them and get them ready. And there's going to be about a half-hour break for lunch, because the village has graciously provided lunch back there for everybody. So we're going to take a little longer break to make sure everybody gets a chance to eat and mingle and get your questions ready. And we'll come back here and start asking those. Thank you. We're going to spend about the next hour answering and going through some questions that you all have submitted. So we're going to go till about 1:30, and then Joe Hotch is asked to speak at the very end just to close out the proceedings. So we'll have one comment from Joe at the end to close us out and end the day right after 1:30. So we won't be able to get to all the questions probably in that time, but again, if you have that sheet that's in the back that lists all our presenters, it also has all their contact information. And feel free to contact them with your questions if we didn't get to it today. I know they may be here for a few minutes afterward, but I think they have planes to catch today as well. So I'll just start out. There's a lot of different topics actually in these questions than we had last night in Haines, which is exciting. So I'm going to try to group some of them together, but there's a lot of questions. I'm going to start out with a question we did have last night. I forget who exactly addressed this, but who can talk about the bonding and what it means, what is required when a mine needs bonding, how that is determined, and how bonding works as far as during a catastrophe or catastrophic failing or closure or bankruptcy and things like that. Who would like to start with that? Okay, great.
John Hoppy, geologist with BLM. Bonding, as far as, well, all federal agencies, but mostly with the BLM, there's supposed to be a financial guarantee in place. So if a company or any operator goes into default or goes bankrupt or just, as they say, drop the keys on the table and walk out, that the government could take this financial guarantee and let a contract for a third party to go in and do the reclamation as it's proposed in the reclamation plan. So in theory, rip the reclamation plan out of the plan of operations, hand that to a contractor, and then that money should be able to pay for that third party to go in and do the reclamation and get it back to, and to meet the reclamation standards. A bond is not insurance. So it's a performance bond. It's to perform the reclamation in default. So if there's something catastrophic, we don't bond for an accident or some sort of catastrophic event. So I know in BLM regulations, the party doing with the approved plan of operations, they're individually responsible for any costs that go to in our case, the BLM to do if we have to do the reclamation. So if there's reclamation that exceeds the reclamation plan, they're responsible for those costs. And there are procedures in place for our solicitors, our lawyers to work with the Department of Treasury to seize assets. So in that case, some of it pertains to the solvency of the company. And if they're in forfeiture, that's in bankruptcy, that's a difficult situation.
Okay.
Anyone else
Anybody
have?
want to talk? Dave, you talked about that last night. Does Dave and Bob? Yeah.
I was just going to tell. I was going to tell two stories. One is that as a reminder of how far we've come, and not to say we don't have more to go. Full bonding was only required in Alaska beginning, I believe, in July 2004. Before that, on state land, we didn't require full bonding. I was director when we pushed that bill through, and I actually worked with Dave on drafts of the bill. Just to tell you something about DNR you may not know. So it's just as an indication of how far things have come. Also, just as a story, in 1996, we did have a bankrupt mine, a mine that went bankrupt before full bonding was required. And We had to pull a bond it was a small bond. We ended up being able to reclaim that mine without any public money, but it was sort of odd. I mean, I didn't know how hard it was going to be to pull the bond, but I sent a letter to this bank in Denver that had the money, dear sir, please send me $1.5 million, love, Bob. And 3 days later, I had a check. It was, now the bankruptcy trustee sent another letter that said, he's right, send it to him. But it was sort of, I don't know, I was surprised.
So as Bob has indicated, this bonding for mining is an issue that's developing. The bonds that are required now cover the costs of reclamation and closure, which would also include long-term water treatment. But these are only for what I call reasonably foreseeable conditions. So, as John mentioned, that bond does not cover a catastrophic failure like Mount Poly. And in fact, you can't get a bond or insurance or anything for a failure like that. The reason being that the cost is too high, and hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up a failure like that, and the pool of participants is too small. So you just don't have a big enough pool of people to spread that risk over, unless you did it worldwide. And I think it would, if you could pull every mine in the world into a pool like that, you could probably make it work. But if you sort of think about how you would do that from a governmental standpoint, it probably wouldn't work. It would probably have to be some sort of industry initiative. The other thing I'd like to say is that even though we've made some significant stride forward with bonding, I still have a few recommendations for further improvements. One of them being that I think the states and the federal government, rather than starting with an estimate that's done by the mining company, and quite frankly, there's an incentive to keep that as low as possible if it comes from the company, and then trying to revise it from there, I would suggest that the government, whether it be state or federal, hire their own engineering company who does this thing for a living, because they obviously have more experience and more resources to accomplish that. Let them make that estimate, let them put their reputation behind it, and then that's what you negotiate with the mining company over. And I have a story to tell about that too. I actually did this in the Yukon Territory about 10 years ago now for a mine called Brewery Creek, which is now closed, and they're actually looking at maybe reopening because price of gold has gone up. But in the hearings on the what's called the water license there, which is the same thing as a water discharge permit here, when they were looking at reclamation, I said, Yukon Territory ought to hire your own engineering company to take a look at this, and I didn't have a chance to work out an estimate myself, except what was literally a back of the envelope calculation, and I told them what I thought the number should be, which was significantly higher than what the company had proposed, and sure enough, they went out and they hired their own engineering company, and they got an estimate, and by golly, it was really close to what my back of the envelope calculation was. So I just think that's a safer way to go, because what we're trying to do is protect taxpayers, you and me, from having to pay the costs of a bankruptcy for one of these mines.
Anybody else?
I was just going to say that there are some other models too that help, and that one is that I know Nevada has been developing some standard financial models that they require the companies to use. And so that gets the company out of saying, well, I'm going to make this assumption, because the assumptions are already built into the model approved by the agency. I think you guys might be working on something similar.
I'll try to summarize what some of the other folks just said. First, the mine company has to produce a reclamation and closure plan. How will they close the mine? stabilize the mine, and reclaim the area. And then what monitoring will they do post-closure to verify that the expectations of the outcomes are being met? That's the reclamation and closure plan. Then they have to assign costs to implementing that plan. Those are the reclamation and closure costs. The federal and state agencies review the plan and the costs, and they have to approve it after significant back and forth with the mine company and their consultants. When they settle on the final costs, that becomes the financial assurances, the bonding that the federal and state agencies require the company to post prior to implementing the activities that would result in the need for closure. That bond is then provided. There's a number of mechanisms, everything from cash and gold to surety bonds or letters of credit. Those have to be from approved financial institutions that are licensed to do business in Alaska. And once that is provided, then the company can start implementing those activities. Reasonable foreseeable is actually written into the statutes at the state level, and so that's why the costs have to be for reasonable or foreseeable activities and challenges that the mine would face. The other presenters are correct that unknown events like an asteroid hitting the site, those things cannot be accounted for. We engineer tailings dams and other facilities not to fail, so you can't come from the position that the engineering is going to result in a failure, and those would be non-bonded as well.
Okay, this might be one for Kyle or anybody else who wants to weigh in. What might be the impact of the budget shortfalls we're talking about right now on the state level on monitoring and permitting of mining projects? I think they're talking about, of course, the low price of oil, and everybody's talking about what's going on with the state budget. I don't know that the federal budget is in much danger right now of cutting anything. Is that something you're comfortable answering, Kyle?
Read the question again. I'll answer it.
Okay. What might be the impact of the budget shortfalls on the state, going through the state right now, regarding permitting and monitoring of mining projects in the future?
Okay. So the state is facing a projected budget deficit, $3 billion, give or take. The legislature is working through the budget process. State law requires that they pass a balanced budget. They'll probably have to use funds from the Budgetary Reserve Fund to do that this year. It comes down to what revenues are coming in and what expenditures are going out. The question is, how might that affect the regulation of mining activities? Great question. I don't think I have anything as an answer you could really hang your hat on, but here's how I will answer it, is that we're obligated, the state of Alaska, to regulate mining activities. And so the obligation to monitor and validate and verify doesn't go away. We need funding to have experts and biologists and water chemists and regulators in those positions. DNR, I think, is facing dozens of losses of positions, as is Fish and Game and DEC. It's going to be a challenge to work in declined budget scenarios. It's something that the state has done before, in the 80s, and And so that's one way. When you're talking about specifically about mining, though, again, earlier I mentioned that the coordinated mine process employs a user pays model, and so luckily we're able to fund the regulation of these large mines through those funding agreements. So the mining companies, for the most part, on large hard rock mines, pay for those activities of regulation. And so that, I think, is a really effective model for mitigating potential effects from budget shortfalls at the state level.
Actually, I'm going to the question that's a very good follow-up to that, talking about that process of the user pay is, well, do you see that as a conflict of interest if the mining companies are paying for that process? That's the question.
No. So that's the short answer. Here's why. I mentioned when I talked about that the actual process is that the general fund has to pay for the activities carried out by the regulatory agencies, Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, Fish and Game. When those activities then are accounted for and billed to the project proponent, the payment is remitted back to the state, to the Department of Revenue. It pays back the general fund. And so it's a mechanism for the state to recover those costs, not for those expenses or those payments to directly fund a particular biologist or mine engineer or something like that. So there's a built-in separation, if you will, through that. The other part I'll go into super briefly is that executive branch agencies cannot generate their own revenues. We have to be granted or delegated that authority from the legislature. Again, the separation of powers in our government. And so the way that looks is that the legislature each year has to appropriate to, I'll use my department only as an example, Department of Natural Resources receipt authority to enter into those funding agreements with the mining companies. And then it's that receipt authority that, by a matter of policy, the legislature is allowing the department to incur those expenses up to that defined limit, and then that money is initially paid by the general fund, and then the bills go back to pay back the general fund. So all of that builds to the answer of why, or explaining why it's not a conflict of interest. But we're still accountable as public administrators to the public interest, not to the mining companies that we regulate.
Anybody else want to? No? Okay. Dave, I'm sorry, Dr. Chambers wanted to talk.
So there's a concept in social science called regulatory capture. And basically what that means is that the regulated community captures the regulatory community. And I think that's a fundamental concern when you have a relationship like this, where we have a set of folks within an agency working directly and paid essentially by the industry. Now, having said that, what's the alternative? I mean, the alternative would basically be to fund those same people out of the general fund, and I don't think that's appropriate either. So I fundamentally, personally have to agree with that funding mechanism, but I still think we need to look at the process and keep looking at it skeptically because there is this certainly potential for regulatory capture, which has a whole bunch of other side effects associated with it.
Sorry, here, this one comes up. This one's a little bit wordy, but I'm going to take, I don't personally know about this executive order, but I'm going to ask it, assuming that it exists. Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898 provides Native, minority, and low-income communities the opportunity to address health, social, and other impacts from industrial development under the NEPA process. How does BLM and DNR address environmental justice concerns, and how does a community initiate that process?
What's the number again?
12898. I didn't have time to look this up or the internet on my phone to do so, so I don't know if anybody knows of this executive order right off their head. It looks like Dave's looking it up. Maybe we can let him, are you looking? No? Okay. You want to try it? Okay.
I'll have to get back to you on that. I do not know the answer to that. I do know that tribal organizations, government to government, is part of the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act process, and it's initiated through the BLM, the field manager, the authorized officer that's in charge of that decision process. You initiate into a government-to-government consultation, and you become a part of the NEPA process. You sit at the table with all the rest of the agencies through the review process, the environmental review process of the document. And you're involved on that process more than just being on a public commenting component. You're sitting at the table, and so obviously in Alaska, because of our very unique land status, and we have the corporations in the state of Alaska and the BLM and all the other agencies. It's a major part of our NEPA process. That's a regular part of our NEPA process, is engaging the communities and the stakeholders in that process. But I can't speak specifically to this order, but I will definitely get the person that knows the specifics to this answer in contact with Meredith or whatever might be to be able to provide the specifics on that whole process. But I do know that there is an avenue, and it is something that's done regularly. Tyler? Okay.
Dave, Doug.
So I would strongly encourage any indigenous government or organization that can be recognized and get this participating agency status to do so, because it's a very powerful thing to be able to sit around the discussion table when these issues are being discussed before they've even been finalized, say, for a draft. The downside to that is that you have to have the resources to be able to partake in those discussions, and especially on the technical side of things, when you're talking about tailings dams and waste rock piles and reclamation, often don't have that sort of knowledge readily at hand. But even though the NEPA process, which, by the way, NEPA is basically a disclosure statute. It is not a decision. There is no decision that comes out of a NEPA analysis. NEPA is meant to disclose a full range of options, but it's not, one is not obligated, for instance, to pick the environmentally preferred alternative. In fact, that's often not picked. It's just a way to present, get a lot of information out there on the table. But the public does not have the freedom to participate in this NEPA analysis at every stage. In fact, the general public only has an opportunity to participate at a few points, like in a mine EIS at the draft submit comments, but we don't get to sit down and view all the deliberations or even all the fundamental documents that are being considered during the process until those documents become available for comment during the release of a draft. So again, if you can become one of the participants in the project, that gives you a significant advantage, and you really ought to take advantage of it if you can.
You want to say something? Okay, Guy.
And I'd like to kind of broaden the scope of the question just a little bit, if I may, or the answer. The executive orders, do cover actions by federal agencies, and the EPA is currently going through guidance, Environmental Justice 2014, that's still a work in progress. But there are also international standards for consultation as well. And as, sovereign indigenous nations, I wouldn't suggest that you are limited by what the U.S. federal government may consider consultation. The international standard has to do with what's called free, prior, and informed consent. And all those words have definite meanings. Free is that the information is provided to you in a form that you can decipher. Prior means it happens before a decision is made. Informed is what it sounds like. You are informed. And consent means that the community does have the right to consent, basically say yes or no to that action. And that's an international, maybe not standard, but action and definition that I think still needs to be mentioned.
Thank you, Guy. And actually, maybe I'll have you address this question. This one came up last night, too, and it only came up in a couple questions in this stack, but since we discussed it last night, it was pretty informative. As you probably know, the village is recommending that the Chilkat be designated an outstanding national resource water. And so someone asked, two people asked what that would actually mean for the river in terms of mining activity. And I think, Guy, you kind of answered that last night. Do you want to take it again?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So under the federal guidance, that's kind of the baseline for all the state guidance. Under the Clean Water Act, they define 3 levels of water quality as a baseline. Some states have adopted 4, maybe 5 different definitions of water quality in a water body. So you have criteria. Basically, there are numeric standards for the protection of fish, maybe, or drinking water, or industrial water, or processed water. You may have an example of numeric criteria would be 3.4 parts per billion of copper, 0.002 parts per billion lead. They have what are called narrative standards as well, or narrative criteria. The water can't have an oily sheen or have floating debris, turbidity, somewhat of a narrative standard. So the federal government, under anti-degradation, which Alaska adopted 27, 29 years ago, a long time ago anyway, they define 3 levels of water bodies. A Tier 1 water body is a water body that's already been identified as being impaired by a certain pollutant. Some pollutant does not currently meet the criteria for that use, whether the use is aquatic life or drinking water. And then the state will set a discharge limits for that pollutant. They won't be allowed to continue to add more of that to the water body. So in many respects, those water bodies are off the table for further degradation. If it still passes in, say, lead, then they may allow more lead in the water, but certainly not the pollutant that's already exceeded. Going up the scale in water quality, the next level is a Tier 2 water body. Tier 2 are considered far better shape than what's necessary to protect that designated use. The water quality is great. And those are the water bodies that are generally subject to discharge permits or degradation because they have the ability to add pollutants to that water body and still keep it above the baseline necessary defined to protect that use. They have what's called an assimilative capacity. Then there's a third level defined by the federal government, and that's a Tier 3. It's an outstanding national resource water.
And that's what this.
And that's what the question is. They're talking about getting the Chilkat River designated as a Tier 3 water. And in general, from the federal point of view, it can be outstanding in a number of ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be high quality chemical water. It can be outstanding because of its fishery values, because of its wildlife values, its scenery, its scientific values, its cultural values. And an outstanding natural resource water, you cannot degrade the quality of that water. Does that mean you can have no action there? No, it doesn't. Almost every state has exemptions for temporary actions. You know, if you need to build a bridge and you're going to create a short-term temporary impact, that's allowed. If you're going to do restoration work where you may stir up sediments and you get turbidity or sediments in the water, that's allowed as long as it's short-term. Many states read that as being you could still discharge into that water as long as the discharge meets that water quality criteria. It's not adding to the pollutant load in that water body. And in some states they have a tier, 2A and a tier, they parse it out a little thinner than that. So there currently is no mechanism for nominating and getting a Tier 3 water body in Alaska. In the 27 some odd years since they adopted anti-degradation, the state has never gone through developing the guidance of how they would implement things like nominating a Tier 3 water body. Or for that instance, analyzing whether a Tier 2 is, good enough to, beyond assuming it has high water quality, to be degraded. But I guess to answer the question is, if indeed the state did, and it would be precedent setting, there are no Tier 3 water bodies designated in the state of Alaska. If it were so designated, the bottom line would be that water quality has to be maintained. It cannot be degraded under any circumstances, except for the short-term actions.
Anybody else? Okay. Bob,
Can I just mention one thing?
yeah, go ahead. And then you can keep it down there because the next question is for Bob.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add there is that the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation has a really good public website that talks about Tier 3, where they're at in that process of developing implementation standards for that, and how it fits into the anti-degradation policies, which flows from the Clean Water Act, which Department of Environmental Conservation is now implementing under 404. So I can give that website to anyone that is interested in that.
Thank you. I'm just going to yell Bob here. So there are two questions about your presentation, specifically about cyanide.
Okay.
And I think you mentioned it was somewhat unusual, but I forget that part. But the two questions are, where does the cyanide go, and under what conditions does cyanide actually break down? And maybe you can touch on again just when is cyanide actually used?
Cyanide is often used mostly by gold mines to separate the gold from the ore. So Greens Creek does not have a cyanide circuit, and Kensington does not have a cyanide circuit. Pogo, which is uniquely gold, does. Red Dog doesn't. Fort Knox does. Anyway, so whether they would here, it's not. My understanding is that Constantine is not primarily a gold mine, so probably not, but maybe they could. How does it break down? It's carbon and nitrogen. It breaks down by bacteria, and it breaks down by sunlight. It breaks down by any oxidant. So oxidants are hydrogen peroxide, anything. And so what it will tend to break down is into carbon products like carbon dioxide or nitrogen, into harmless products. In high sulfur environments, it could break down into a toxic product, but in most environments it breaks down into essentially harmless stuff. So cyanide in the Fort Knox Lake is above the standard for fish in the tailings lake. As that water seeps through the soil, it absorbs the soil, it is broken down by the bacteria, and by the time it gets down to where they pick it up at the bottom of the through the dam, it's right at the level of fish water quality standards. So that's the answer.
Okay. Dave?
So just a couple of things to add. One, cyanide is used in small quantities in base metal mines like Greens Creek and Red Dog as a part of the flotation process. And it's significant because at the levels, even though it is pretty dilute, it's tough to treat at those levels because it is dilute, but it's still above the water quality standard. So it's something that you have to watch. And then the other thing about cyanide oxidation is it does oxidize easily in an oxidizing environment. But for instance, in mines that use fairly high levels of cyanide, like 200 and 300 parts per million for processing gold, if that cyanide isn't destructed by a dedicated destruction project, if it gets locked into the interstitial water of the tailings, then it tends not to oxidize. And it can sit there for years, and if those tailings are disturbed, then it can remobilize. So most mines these days use a cyanide destruct process to take that level down quite a ways just for that reason.
Actually, Fort Knox has a cyanide destruct process. They turned it off because they don't, it goes down naturally, but should it come up, they can turn it back on again. And Red Dog does have actually, I think they have a cyanide mixing zone out in, right below the dam. I don't think that Greens Creek doesn't. I think by the time it gets their discharge at Greens Creek, it's at standards.
Okay, thank you. So, lots of, I'll ask this because it's a little, okay. So lots of questions about fish and habitat monitoring and quality. And I know that's a very general question, but who would be willing to kind of go over again what safeguards there are when studying fish and water quality during a mine permitting process, and also if that monitoring continues after a mine closes? Oh, Bob, looks like you want to.
Yeah, I do.
It's very general, but however you want to. Okay.
Well, in order to monitor for fish and water quality, that actually starts before a mine is proposed. So one of the most important things to start with is a lot of good background data so that you have an understanding of what the natural environment is. But one of the reasons why I wanted to answer this question is it's one of the things. Alaska does some things well, some things not so well. I'm actually quite proud of the monitoring system that really Fish and Game designed through Al Ott, Phyllis Scanlon Weber, and Kate does it for Southeast in the back. So during mining and after mining, they do all of the water quality, not Fish and Game, DEC, in the groundwater and in the surface water. Some parameters are monitored essentially close to continuously. Some are monitored weekly, quarterly, monthly, yearly, etc., depending on what DEC says. But then to find out how it's affecting the fish, Fish and Game devised a system where they actually monitor it from top to bottom. They start with the algae, and they look at whether the algae components are changing to, say, metals tolerant algae communities, and then they look at the bugs the fish eat, what they call the benthic community, and then they look at fish populations and metal content. I think this is where I said they do a lab quality blender and blend up the little fish and see if they can extract metals to see if there's metals coming in the fish. So that occurs during mining, and what that's really designed to pick up, I mean, it's really easy to pick up a significant immediate problem, but it's designed to pick up long-term trends, which are much harder to pick up. And I think they actually do a very good job, and so I brag about them, And after mining's done, after the mine closes, the mine is required to pay for some of that monitoring, or as much as necessary. 30 years is the standard amount for a mine that's completely closed and meets standards. So the monitoring frequency will decrease as you get towards 30 years. The first year it might be, I don't know what, quarterly or yearly, and then after a while it becomes every couple of years, et cetera, et cetera. But that's it's a 30-year period. The actual details are dependent on the mine.
Anybody else? Dave?
So I think our monitoring for water quality and for aquatic organisms is pretty good with the large active mines. I think we do have issues with some of the smaller mines. For instance, Nixon Fork, I don't believe there's that kind of data being collected there.
No, I don't think so. But they're also not near water.
Well,
there is more than that.
I don't think it's that level.
And then with closed mines, also, it's sometimes hard to get data. Illinois Creek is one I'd like to see data for, and I haven't been able to find it. But so I think we could make some improvements there. And then with active mines, I think the one area I'd like to see some monitoring improvements is with these mixing zones, especially in salt water. I don't think we've got a really good picture of what's going on there. It's all done by modeling. And Guy talked earlier about some of the weaknesses of modeling, so I think we could do a better job there.
Can I follow up with a question on?
I was just saying, in the saltwater mixing zones, they do monitor the worms and things, the aquatic foundations of the food, to see if they're accumulating any accumulating metals or any contaminants.
There was a follow-up to that, just since he mentioned it.
Okay.
Someone is wondering about the mixing zone at Greens Creek and Hawk Inlet.
Yes.
Can you provide a little bit more information on what you know about, like, what percentage of the inlet is considered a mixing zone, or how a mixing zone is monitored? Or is that?
I think Guy can do that.
I don't know the answers to those specific things. What I will say is that, and I think this will get to both questions. This Alaska Department of Natural Resources, my agency, we have large project pages available on our website, and what those are intended to be is a clearinghouse of information for the large mines, and so you can go onto those websites. The website is www.dnr.alaska.gov/COMMS/OPMP. That's my website, and then there's a link to the large project pages. On those large project pages, you will have the annual biomonitoring reports that Fish and Game puts out. Those are technical documents, technical reports that go through Fish and Game's technical report vetting process. There will also be annual reports that are required as conditions of the waste management permits that the mine hires consultants to put together, and that'll talk about all of the waste streams, how those are managed, all the monitoring that goes into those, and so that's where the information specifically to describe the mixing zone in Hawk Inlet would be found, and the monitoring that would go along to support the compliance with that authorization.
Okay.
I'll try it, and I'll do it too. First, mixing zones are pretty common. They're not really specifically related to mines. For example, I know Haynes has a mixing zone for at least copper and E. coli in, Passage Cove, right off the Portage Cove. So they discharge copper in excess of standards, and E. coli. Actually, almost all municipalities have a mixing zone. So part of the way mixing zones is they figure out what mixing and give it the minimum area, and so it's using the currents in the river, lake, saltwater. So they can the Pogo mixing zone, which is really only for their man camp, is about the size of this table. It's measured in feet, 2 or 3 feet wide and 7 to 10 feet long, something like that. Hawk Inlet's is somewhat bigger. Now, I know there is a disagreement between Guy and maybe Dave and DEC on monitoring the mixing zone. So I'm going to try to do my best to give both sides, just so that you hear both sides. And then you guys can tell your side.
Well, not for too long.
Okay, but my understanding is that in order to do a mixing zone, DEC has to be able to assure itself that there will be no biological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem, including fish. So if there's going to be harm to fish, they're not allowed to approve a mixing zone. Examples, well, I won't go into examples. So with respect to Hawk Inlet, DEC believes that there are various biomonitoring sites and their modeling and the location of the multiple sites they take in Hawk Inlet proves the adequacy of their regulation. Obviously, Guy disagrees, and I'll let you tell his side of the story. But there we go.
Okay.
Two things. One, just quickly, the big issue we have in Hawk Inlet is DEC does require that, say, the benthic organisms, the critters that live on the bottom, they're stuck there, they can't swim away, have the highest exposure duration, are tested for metals, their metal uptake. But what that doesn't show is what we would look at is how many of those worms are down there. It's hard to test a worm for its metal loading if it's dead and gone. And it doesn't look at the diversity of all the different organisms that may have existed at the bottom of Hawk Inlet prior to mining. So there's a bit of a gap there. And we could go into the details ad nauseum. I've been doing it for quite a few years. But what I would say is that when a draft wastewater permit comes out, it will describe what the parameters are for monitoring that receiving water. It'll come out as a draft. There'll be a public comment period. There are no better experts in the world than a lot of the people sitting in this room that have long-term history of seeing trends and what's been going on to your fish and your water than a lot of the people in this room. And so when that draft comes out, you need to take advantage of it and make your comments and make yourself heard. Look at how they are monitoring, where they're placing the monitoring sites. Put that in your mind and history of that area, and you make the decision whether that's adequate or not, and make those comments. That's what I would say.
I agree with that.
All right, thank you. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, and one of the other big topics in the questions was tailings. So I'm going to ask about 3 or 4 questions here just to cover it, and then we can kind of, however you guys want to discuss this. As far as tailings, how long do tailings last? And would dry stacking tailings actually work in this environment, meaning a coastal temperate rainforest and a valley that gets lots and lots of snowfall? Who would like to start with that? I know that's, okay, Kyle.
Can you read the question one more time?
Sure.
How long will they last?
How long do tailings last? Or tailings
So tailings are demineralized rock. They're rock. They'll last forever.
It says dam, actually, a tailings dam.
Oh, a tailings dam.
I guess
That's
that
different.
was my mistake. I didn't.
Okay, now that's a bait and switch.
Okay.
No, I'm just
How many years? I
don't want to answer that.
realized that. I'm sorry.
Okay, give it to me one more time.
How many years will a tailings dam last?
Okay, so that depends. There's mine plans that call for a tailings dam to be removed at closure or breached at closure, and then there's mine plans that call for the dam to be maintained in perpetuity, and so there's examples of both. So there's not a single answer to that. The best answer I can give is that that is determined based on the specific project criteria and challenges and requirements of the mine project.
Okay. And then do you want to address too, dry stacking tailing? How do dry stacking tailings, how can those work in an environment like this, a coastal rainforest and heavy snowfall?
Sure. We have a great example here in Southeast in that coastal temperate rainforest, and that's Greens Creek. I think it's agreed, although I'd be interested, but it's not agreed, that Greens Creek provides a perfect example of how dry stacking can work effectively in this climate, because it has been.
It has worked, so that's okay.
One of the things that we have here in the Upper Clukey that Greens Creek doesn't have to deal with is the tonnages of snow, the mass tonnages of snow, and the seismic activity to go with it.
Oh, you're right, that said seismic too. Okay, so seismic and the heavy snow. Okay. Are there any...
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. I mean, that's part of what I'm getting out of this meeting is that type of site-specific information. So I really appreciate that, but I think James wants to talk, and then we'll go here.
So from the BLM's perspective for tailings options, and especially like a dry stack, it's case-by-case basis again, but if a scenario played out where you did have a dry stack in an environment like this, it'd be unique, obviously, because there's not very many places in the world that are like this. We would look at what the snow load is like, what are avalanche frequency, averages, trying to figuring out what the snow conditions do, what those kind of things, and how they could possibly impact to identify proper placement locations. You can decide, well, this is the best location based on those conditions. And with a dry stack, unlike a tailings impoundment where you have a dam that is a feature that is holding back something, it's a structural feature that is prone to failure. The dry stack is intended to be placed permanently in there, and it's dry stack. And the reason they call it dry stack is they try to achieve 12 to 20% or lower water content in the interstitial spaces of that soil. So I mean, it's really dry stuff. And so when you're putting it down there, you're placing it, then you're compacting it in what they call lifts. You only place it in something about 8 inches thick or so, and then you run compaction over it, and you really compact it down, and it makes it very hard for water to percolate down through those areas. And then you add a slope to that, and you create it so that it actually sheds water. Just like when you expose soils, a hard pan in the deserts or something like that, where it's just very, very hard and it doesn't percolate down through. So your intent is to get it out there, compact it, and provide the ability for the water to take the path of least resistance and flow down off of it. But the question about snow and the impacts on those are great considerations, and analysis would have to happen on identifying what areas typically are impacted by avalanches or high snow loads, and how those would play in the physics of how that dry stack would be placed. But again, speculation. I don't know if that's even going to be an option here or not. So just some ideas.
Okay, anybody else? There was kind of a short. Oh, Guy. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that there's another factor besides water, and that's wind. And, with any fairly new technology and the amount of engineering that went into Greens Creek's dry stack system and their subsequent closure of it is new technology, you generally have unforeseen negative impacts. And in this case, with no fault of Greens Creek or their folks, it was wind. And especially during the winter, they have to have it open. They have to not have snow on that to put tailings down. winter tends to be a very dry time. The humidity is very dry. Those tailings dry very fast, and before they can get them compacted, they were having issues with the wind picking up some of that dust and taking it into the forest. And indeed, they noticed that it was happening. It happened, and now they're trying to take steps to mitigate that, to measure it and find ways to mitigate it, and maybe time their deposits of tailings, put up snow fences, try to break the wind and things like that. But with any new technology, it's hard to foresee. In hindsight, it's very clear. Trying to look in the future, therein the problem often lies.
Dave. Actually, Dave, can I?
May I?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ed. Go ahead. Yes?
May I assert myself?
I defer to you always, sir.
Your tailings and your wastewater to something like H2O2 heavy water. Yes or no?
Well, no. H2O2 would be hydrogen peroxide.
Would be heavy.
It's heavier than H2O, but there's no heavy water,
Well,
meaning, an extra neutron in there, in your typical mine wastewater, at least not, non-uranium mines.
H2O2 is heavier than H2O.
That's true.
I have to put my dialogue in a narrative form, and I want to utilize Professor Bob's opening statement. Mining is a water project. The byproducts gold, tailings. Now, back to James. BLM, what's my note say, 43 million acres?
27 million, I think.
27 million?
Yes.
72 million.
72 million, yes. 72 million acres managed by the BLM Alaska.
It seems you can recycle the water, but if you don't recycle, you're going to be coming after my drinking water here. So, assuming that's doable, you can engineer a recycled water by recycling the wastewater.
Correct, and that actually is a modern practice that they use in these, a lot of times when you have a tailings dam facility that stores a water, that pond, they can recycle that water. They actually have intake pumps that pull that water back into the mill and use that to facilitate the processing, and then it's discharged instead of pulling water from the environment, which occasionally you do have to do as makeup water.
The recycling can be contained in Dave's Thailand dam, lined with plastic. Plastic is here to stay. So
The reactor?
it's a H2O lighter than H2O2. Yes.
Well, yes, because it has one less oxygen.
Okay. If my statement is correct, Guy, H2O will be on top. That's your recycled water.
Yes. Yeah, the water will be on top, and then they do recycle it because it's generally more economical for the mine to recycle their water than to pump and search out, new sources of water. But they do, almost all of them recycle their water that I can think of. But we tend, and then Bob was right, about the water, and other people have said it, but, mining in this country, it's not like you have a large mine and a wastewater treatment plant. In this country, you have a large wastewater treatment plant that's associated with a mine. But we don't characterize mines that way. We call mines gold mines or copper mines by the concentrate that they produce. But if we looked at what they produce, maybe we should be calling them waste rock mines and tailings mines, because that's predominantly what's produced.
It's okay. I was going to follow up. Oh,
Just a minute.
what, did you have a comment or a question?
I have a comment.
Do you want to wait? Do you want to talk to them after?
I'm not gonna wait.
I will let you go. Go for it.
I've been sitting here since 10 o'clock, and I've listened to these men since 10 o'clock, mentioning 4 or 5 different mines. Not one time did they mention what mine they're talking about. And I want to know what mine you're talking about. You've pussyfooted around this way and that way. We're not the dumb Indians you think we are. So when you're talking to us, speak plainly. What do you want from us?
Do you want me to? Do you mind?
No,
oh, okay.
I want them to answer it.
Well, if you won't mind if I do first, please.
No.
Well, I think
I don't want you to answer for them.
I'm not answering for them.
Answer.
I'm answering for
Because
myself.
I've been sitting here listening to them talking about this, that, and the other, and then they talk so fast, telling me, I want to know which mine they're talking. They mention about Polymine.
Yes.
They never even showed what happened to Polymine. I don't want this to happen to us.
I understand.
And that mine is right, the one that they're talking about, is that the one right here? Do you know how slushy it is, even in the summertime? You walk right into water. Now put that in your peace pipe and smoke it. Tell me how you're gonna walk around that. I seen you bulldozing 2 big football fields of bulldozing. Tell me about Hawk Inlet. I was there, fishing there. I'm going on 74 years old. Don't talk to me like if I was newborn. We want to know what's going on. Don't talk about this, that, and the other, and 3 other things. Tell us what's going on. Don't tell us how much money we're going to be making. Don't read off something that looks like some white person has asked. This is Tlingit land. And we're going to go on Angska. That's it. Now put that in your peace pipe and smoke it.
Thank you. I was just going to mention that we do have a representative from Constantine here. Her name is Liz, and she's in the back of the room. And she invited me to mention that she's here. She's been here for both presentations.
Now that you mention it towards the end, right now.
Well, I wanted to mention it toward the end because none of the gentlemen up here work for Constantine or are associated with Constantine. Tokshinik Watershed Council decided who should come and speak about mining in general. So I totally respect what you're saying and what your comment. Thank you. And I'm going to give Jones the last word here today. We didn't get to any of the questions, all the questions. Yes, Pat.
Joe.
Did I say Jones?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jones and Joe.
1:30, that's Joe's.
Okay, it's Joe's turn, and he's going to close us out today. And I just want to say thank you for having us here today and allowing me to facilitate in the A&S Hall. And thank you on behalf of all the gentlemen here at the table. And you have their contact information. And I'll turn it over to Joe to close us out. I'll bring it over there, Joe, or do you want to? Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to read a little comment here, but before I do that, we hear that there's no harm in mining. But we look at the mine by Point Sherman. Fish used to come past there, gill netters. There might be some here. Used to come all the way. And now the fishermen have to go all the way to Burners Bay. There's some kind of harm being done. And I'll stop at that one. I thank you folks again. You did a good job. And there's some people there that will understand more than I do, but I'd like to speak about my culture, which is important to me and my children. Number one, mining seems to do some kind of harm and injury, especially to salmon, wildlife, berries of many kinds. We are dependent as Native people of this area, and we would like to pass our way of life to our children and grandchildren, and they can pass it on to their children and grandchildren. Many job seekers will be near our village here. Some may be drug and alcohol users, which will not be comfortable. We will not be comfortable with. We do not want our children observing such activities. And the screen you are sitting in front right there represents every clan house in this community. You are in the clan house. We thank you, and we put important people in front of those screens. You see some parts that's not painted. And our elders told us, we have a hard time coming. We will not complete the painting. The children behind us, grandchildren, will finish our lives. So it's not going to be painted. It's just handed down to our children and grandchildren to keep on living. We're not giving up on our lives. We will continue to live as we are Native people of this area. Thank you. Oh, one more comment. Indian allotments are Indian country. There are over 70 Indian allotments here, 106 acres each. I don't know if they were informed about this, because the wildlife that they depend to live on, the salmon, goes through their allotment. So I don't think we touched everybody on this meeting in between Hayes and Tlaloquan. And there's a lot of people on the highway, I'm sure, that haven't heard about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
My stomach is crawling. When do we eat again?
Did you something?
I think it is.